Good evening, welcome to Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad.
In joining us on the show tonight, we have Professor Philip Alston, who is the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. Welcome to the show, Philip.
Thank you.
I'd like to kind of first start the show off with a better understanding of what a Special Rapporteur does. Could you just brief us very quickly what that role entails?
When the UN first set up the Human Rights Council, the challenge was to get some sort of objective assessment of what was going on in countries. No one really trusted the UN officials to do that because that would politicize them. And so what they did was to develop this system where they appoint independent experts who come in. They have expertise in a particular issue. My focus happens to be poverty, but it might be violence against women, it might be religious freedom, it might be torture. And these independent experts do an assessment of different countries and submit it to the UN Human Rights Council. The important thing is that it's sort of reciprocal. So Malaysia doesn't particularly like to have a special rapporteur, but they're happy for special rapporteurs to go to a whole range of other countries and look at what's going on. And so in order to be part of that system, they do it as well.
And I suppose you also, as I understand correctly, governments have to invite special rapporteurs in. So you're here because the Malaysian government was open to the idea of having you here. Would that be correct?
That's
right.
And
how's the reception been so far?
Very good, very good.
Right, okay, so they're open. But I do want to ask this question though. You know, many people think of human rights, and they hear the term human rights, they think of civil and political liberties and issues around that. How does poverty fit into that perception of what human rights work is about?
Well, it's a very good question. If we stay with your definition, first of all, people forget to look at the extent to which poor people are the ones who suffer civil and political rights violations most severely. So if you look at torture, if you look at the death penalty, if you look at whatever issue it is, violence against women, it's the poor who are the most significant victims. They can't defend themselves, they're easy targets, they don't have defense, and so even if you're just focused on civil and political rights, the poverty angle is important. But the conception of human rights that the UN adopted way back in 1948 actually has two sets of rights. It also has economic, social and cultural rights. And the deal at that time, and I think it still is today, is that it's not enough to have civil and political rights. You have to have food, you have to have housing, you have to have water, have to have education. And so it's important to look at both sets of rights. And again, if you're poor, you're going to be particularly badly done by in terms of those other issues.
Well, so you were here in Malaysia for the past 11 days, touring the country, visiting with different people, stakeholders. And in a statement that you made this morning, you said that Malaysia has been vastly undercounting poverty. In fact, actual poverty rates are much higher than official figures suggest. This is really quite striking, Philip. Could you explain, go into further detail, what you mean by Malaysia undercounting poverty?
Right. Well, every country has some sort of poverty line. In other words, at what point do we conclude that someone is really so poor that ideally they should be getting different forms of assistance from the government, or that there should be government programs that are directed towards them? So in some respects, a government can set the level wherever it likes. You know, you could say, well, if you're earning less than 10 ringgit a year, you're poor. Of course, it'll give you 0. Normally, there are international guidelines to suggest where you should set it and what you should take into account. What the Malaysian government has done was to set a figure back in 1970, which has been adjusted a little, but barely at all. And so today, it's only if you are under 980 ringgit a month for a household that you're considered poor. Now, a household might have 6, might have 8, might have 10 people in it. And if they're living on 980 ringgit, they're going to be worse than poor. They're going to be really, really badly off.
Can I ask you, are there best practices when it comes to setting these standards? And are there kind of objectives, objective standards? For instance, you know, taking nutrition as a benchmark for poverty, rather than just how much the family gets in terms of money, but actually what is the content of the food that people are consuming, because it affects child development, for instance.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are two different approaches. One is just pure income. And pure income is, of course, a bit misleading, because if you're living in a rural paradise and you've got fruit trees all around you and so on, you actually don't need as much income. The fruit is falling down, you can go and fish and so on. If you're living in an urban area where there's none of that available and prices are much higher, then obviously the income level needs to be much more. But the inadequacy of that approach has long been recognised, and most international agencies now use what they call a multi-dimensional poverty index. And that precisely takes account of housing, takes account of food, it takes account of access to education and a range of other things. So you look holistically and say, well, how is this family doing? And that gives you a much more complex picture, and obviously a lot more people then are deprived in one way or another.
So Malaysia does adopt this kind of multi-dimensional poverty matrix, or having different types of categories of poverty. But that poverty line that you mentioned, Philip, 980 ringgit a month for a household, that makes, according to the statistics that are out there, 0.4% of Malaysians living under the poverty line. That means less than 25,000 households in Malaysia, which realistically doesn't make sense, because the average poverty rate for a country in Malaysia's kind of GDP bracket would be about 15 to 20%. So it has remained artificially low because it hasn't been adjusted. Is that accurate to say?
Yes, basically.
Okay. And why? I mean, and this, of course, is the more important question, right? Because the policy implications of having a statistic that says that we have almost negligible amounts of poverty are quite significant, right? In policy terms, it's significant.
I mean, the problem, of course, is that it's political. And I don't mean in the sense of any given political party, but no government wants to suddenly say, actually, yesterday you thought that there were no people in poverty in our country. Well, now I've got to confess to you it's 1 in every 6 or 1 in every 8 or whatever. They don't want to do that. I think what happened in Malaysia, I don't think anyone ever took a decision saying, we're going to be really deceitful here, we're going to fool our own people and the rest of the world. I think they started off with a relatively low poverty line, but one that was realistic in 1970. The country's GDP then grew maybe 5 times in that period, but the poverty line certainly didn't go up much at all.
And that's very generous, though. I mean, the professionals tasked with collecting data and making the assessments surely know that as time passes, things need to be adjusted, including the yardstick by which they're measuring things. I mean, that would be, unless our bureaucracy is staffed with people who have no comprehension of economics and are not kind of plugged into global conversations about it, that would be quite extraordinary.
I don't know how to explain it. I mean, this morning I met with a large group of government officials to present my report, and most of them, those who spoke, were highly defensive of the existing system and said, no, it's 0.4. No, we have almost no poverty. I guess no matter who is in power, if you go and say, Minister, I want you to put up the level and suddenly announce that there are more people in poverty and therefore you should be spending more money, it's just not going to be well received. Yeah.
So we're going to come back and continue this conversation about especially what this means. So I guess undercounting poverty, what that means for policymakers and the lack of a proper social safety net for poor Malaysians. We're going to continue right here on Consider This. Make sure you stay tuned. Welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris with Sharaad Kuttan, and on the show, Professor Philip Alston, United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. Sharaad, you had a question for Philip about what he knew about Malaysia before coming here.
Yeah, you know, we've been talking in this country about the cost of living. It's a hot political potato, and all sides of the political divide are trying to address it in some ways. It's not that Malaysian policymakers or politicians are unaware of the pressures, the economic pressures on the lives of most ordinary Malaysians. What did you know? Did you know that you know, coming in, there's been this discussion? What were your general impressions of Malaysia before you landed, and did, you know, your kind of conversations with people over 11 days?
I have to admit at a personal level that I was first here almost 50 years ago. One of my daughters got married in Langkawi a few years back. I've been to Malaysia quite a few times. So I've long had a sense of the place. I realized how really poor it was in 1971 when I was here. And of course I'm struck when I come back by how dramatically improved the situation is. It's a transformed country, no question. For these sorts of missions, what I do, I've got a staff working with me, team. They do endless interviews of experts within the country primarily, but not only. We did 70, 80 interviews, all of which lasted for an hour or so. We read all of the available reports. We spoke with a lot of the civil society groups here and others. So by the time I arrived in KL, almost 2 weeks ago, I had a briefing book about that thick, which is all specifically directed at our issues that we're looking at. So I was very well informed, I think it's fair to say.
Did you find that data was readily available to you? I mean, statistical data specifically on issues like poverty can be deemed quite sensitive material. Was it made available to you readily?
One of the peculiarities of Malaysia is the extent to which there is a lack of transparency with statistics, and particularly things that are considered sensitive. So poverty data, particularly some sort of breakdown, how do the Bumiputras break down between the Malays and the indigenous, etc. How do the other ethnic groups come out? What's the difference male and female? Unfortunately, we don't have that information available.
So what they said to you, was that the refrain?
Yeah. And then there was a number of conversations with officials at the state level where I would say, do you have this information? And they'd say, we'll have to get back to Putrajaya for that, the Department of Statistics. Not sure if they'll give it to us or not. Then World Bank, how do you go with statistics? Do you get everything you want? Nope. Unfortunately, they won't give us full access to the microdata and so on. So even when they're trying to do the analyses, they don't get it. And that's a real problem because poverty policy requires pretty careful targeting. You've got to know who your groups are, you've got to know who's doing badly, who's doing well, and the statistics that are available are not adequate.
Right. So when you talk about sensitive issues in Malaysia, race is obviously one of them, and you mentioned the Bumiputra, non-Bumiputra, and also divisions within that. Regional differences, of course, are also often used, especially now, in mobilizing kind of states' rights politics in Sabah and Sarawak. For instance, Sabah, resource-rich territory, feeling, in fact, that they've been left behind, that somehow their resources have been taken by the peninsula and so on. Was that something that you were able to get yourself, get a better picture of what's happening in these territories and how, you know, to what extent poverty is deep-rooted in those territories?
Being an Australian, I well understand federal-state politics and the allocation of the national pie and who's contributing and all that sort of stuff. I think that's very important. I certainly saw on my visits to both Sabah and Sarawak the challenges that they were facing, the very different situation that they're in a lot of respects. They do face very particular challenges, obviously, given the size of the two states, given the huge border, its porousness, and all of the other things, given the strong indigenous population in both states. I think things are actually very different, yeah.
Okay. Because it is important to get a sense of who is poor, right?
Yeah.
Understanding who is poor will help government and policymakers create social safety nets that will help them. Now, according to your report, you said Malaysia has about 110 social protection programs across 20 different ministries, but all these social protections seem to have no virtual poverty reduction impact. So I'm just wondering, through what you've seen, is there a way to, I guess, what is the best way to be helping the people that you have seen as and identified as poor?
Well, my logic is pretty straightforward. My logic is that if you pretend there's no poverty, you can't be focusing on it, you can't be attending to it. I don't know whether it's appropriate to use the analogy with drug abuse, but I suspect it is. Until you acknowledge that you've got a drug program, I can't help you. I can't tell you what the treatment is. And if you say we've got no poverty, then there's no program. And so again, what I found here, I asked lots of policymakers, what are you doing in this area? And they would describe programs that would be fine for the B40. But if I say, well, what about the B10 or the B15? They'd say, well, sorry, what's that? And I'd say, look, it's a very different group. You know, the needs of those who really are poor are different from the rest of the B40. And unless you're targeting it, oh no, but we don't have poverty. And so there isn't a sort of cross-government set of policies designed to say, what can we do? What are the key groups that we've got to target? How can we get to the poor Bumiputras, for example, who are the most numerous, the most significant, who have not benefited in the way that one would have thought from the NEP and other initiatives? How can we get to the indigenous people? How can we get to those who are stateless and so on? You've got to have that analysis in place before you can do it. So what happened was that each department, education, health, human resources, etc., all have their own programs, and in those they'll each have some sort of what we call social protection element, but they weren't being coordinated. And so again, I had lots of discussions saying, well, you're doing X. What about the health dimension of the people you're helping? I'm not health, that's him.
And you have a few recommendations, right? We're going to get right into those recommendations after this. Stay tuned to consider this. Welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris with Sharaad Kuttan, and today on the show we have a human rights expert, Philip Alston, here joining us on the show to talk a little bit about poverty in Malaysia and some of the recommendations that you've made after your 11-day visit. Before we go into that, Philip, I do want to ask a bit about some of the policies that we've seen in the past to help people who live below the poverty line, or the B40. Cash handouts has been part of the Malaysian system for a long time. I think it's become an expectation for many, many years. What do you think about the effectiveness of cash handouts in combat or in eradicating poverty?
I think it depends whether they're intended to eradicate poverty or intended to encourage people to vote. So if they're really focused and targeted, they can be very helpful. But the sense that I've got is that the BRIM program, for example, was not particularly well targeted, that there were a lot of wealthy people who were receiving benefits, a lot of very poor people who were not receiving benefits. So I think that sort of program is very problematic. And it makes it worse in a sense because the government can say, but just a minute, we're spending X billions of ringgits. You know, what more are you asking? And the answer is a lot of those billions are not really helping.
I do want to ask, though, you know, we had in the BRIM program recipients numbering, I think initially in the first iterations, about 8 million and then lower. Now, that's a huge number of people who are getting government help on the basis that they need help or they're vulnerable. This is the same government that says that it doesn't have much poverty. So there seems to be a contradiction here. I mean, conceptually, where's the country to go? I mean, it says some people need this money. At the same time, only 0.0%, 4% are actually poor.
I think the justification that government would put to you is that what we're talking about with the poverty line is people who are really hard up, can't survive on their own. But once we get above that, once you get into the B40 territory, then you've got a lot of vulnerability. And that's true, that, you know, if you look at the average savings of, I think, 40–50% of the Malaysian population, they don't have enough to get themselves through retirement or to even cope with a sudden disaster, medical or otherwise. So there is a lot of vulnerability, quite apart from people who are actually living in poverty.
Right. I want to talk about those portions of the population who are most vulnerable. You know, it really feels like when you talk about poverty, the mainstream narrative is that poverty only affects those in rural areas, those, you know, in indigenous communities, marginalized communities. But I want to talk to you about what you found. So yes, there are segments of the population that are, you know, significantly impacted through poverty, which, if you could explain to us what segments these are, and also, you know, in urban poor, because there are a lot of Malaysians out there who are struggling to make ends meet at the end of the day, yet see the figures on poverty and feel a sense of disconnect.
Yes. So the poor it's a very varied group, and as you say, the difference between urban and rural can be very different. If you're in a rural area, you might be really poor, but you've got family, you've got community, you've often got food supplies growing somewhere, and there are ways of getting by. If you move that family to the urban areas, it's all gone. No food supplies readily available, no family assistance, community help, and so on. So suddenly they need considerably more money, and the money doesn't go nearly as far. So big differences there. I think it's very hard. It depends really on the situation of individual families, how many children they've got. If there's a single parent involved, particularly a single mother, who are the overwhelming majority of single parents, they're always in very difficult situations. Indigenous peoples, particularly in Sabah and Sarawak, right, are often not at all well off. You've certainly got, but Malaysians don't count this, the foreign population. But if you've got a population of 32 million or however many, and you then have some estimates go up to 6 million in terms of foreign workers.
Wow. Documented and undocumented.
Yes, the two together. That's a huge number. And those people are by definition not getting assistance. And some of them are getting really low wages. They're not getting the minimum wage. They're supposed to, but there's no enforcement at all. And so that adds a lot to poverty. They have a lot of children. Those children are not getting into schools. If you don't get into school in Malaysia, things are grim. Yeah. If you don't have an MIC, a Malaysian identity card, all sorts of things are going to be unattainable. And poverty is an almost certain element of your future.
And let's try and wrap this conversation up. Yeah. If you could help us understand, you know, what you'd like to see come out of this particular report. The press conference that you had this morning, I believe the story's been taken up in some foreign newspapers as well. So it's gone international. We have about a minute left. What would you like us to focus on? You have recommendations that are fairly general. What is it that you think we need to first do? Okay,
so as I said, first recognise that there really is significant poverty and that has to be addressed. Second, be transparent about the statistics. Third, take social protection seriously. That's a sort of life cycle thing, from young children who are not fed enough all the way through the elderly, the retired and so on. What's required there is an increase in social spending. Malaysian levels of social spending are lower than any of its neighbours in terms of GDP, despite the wealth that's in this country. There's very little money going into social protection. Clearly, taxes could be greatly expanded in terms of collection, not in terms of levels. There needs to be a much more integrated approach. Departments need to come together. I think what the Deputy Prime Minister is doing, the exercise she's overseeing now, is terrific. I think it has huge potential. I think the government needs to see that an investment in a lot of these different social areas, in treating refugees and their children better, will all be economically beneficial. You will build a better Malaysia. You'll build a more productive Malaysia.
There you go. Thank you so much for joining us on the show, Philip. That's all the time we have right here on Consider This. Sharaad and I will be back with you on Monday. Till then, have a great weekend. Thank you. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.